Hi there, everyone. Happy Friday. It's 4 o'clock in New York. He has held no press conferences, done no interviews that we know about. He's elusive. The inner workings of his highly sensitive assignment remain a bit of a mystery to the viewing public, outside of what some journalists have worked to uncover. So when it comes to the enigmatic Special Counsel Jack Smith and his federal investigations, plural, into Donald J. Trump, it takes an ear to the ground, both adept and trained, to know when real progress is being made. This afternoon, trusted voices suggest it is time to buckle up. Here's why. In the days since a federal appeals court in Washington rejected the ex-president's bid to block former staffers from testifying in the January 6 investigation, ex-aides have paraded in and out of depositions without fig leaf protections of executive and attorney-client privilege. On Tuesday, as we reported here, it was ex-speechwriter Stephen Miller. Late yesterday, it was former DNI John Ratcliffe. And very soon, it could be the star witness, Donald Trump's former vice president, Mike Pence himself. Last week, an advisor to Pence said he would not appeal a court order to testify. Today, though, an update. Trump and his attorneys this morning asked a federal appeals court to take, quote, immediate action to block Pence's testimony. We'll monitor that decision for you. It could come down in a matter of days, judging by how quickly other such judgments in this case have been reached so far. But the broader reading of Jack Smith's investigation remains. From the New York Times reporting on this, quote, while questions linger over pending appeals and potential efforts by some of the witnesses to delay things further by invoking the Fifth Amendment, the development suggests that Smith is close to finishing the fact-finding phase of his work and moving closer to a decision about seeking charges against Trump and others. A potential new stage in the federal investigations into Donald Trump's conduct before, during, and after the January 6th insurrection is where we begin today with our favorite reporters and friends. New York Times reporter Katie Benner is back. Also joining us, MSNBC legal analyst Andrew Weissman, whose backgrounds get better and better and better as Jack Smith's probe gets more and more intense. He's a former Justice Department prosecutor, former senior member of Robert Mueller's Special Counsel investigation. Charlie Sykes is also back. He, too, has epic backdrops. He's the editor-at-large of The Bulwark and an MSNBC contributor. Watching all of you get mic'd up and made me miss one thing about COVID was seeing inside everyone's homes. It's nice to see all of you today. Katie Benner, we've sort of walked up to this point this week, I think, in seeing Stephen Miller and seeing the mostly secret court proceedings yield legal defeat after legal defeat after legal defeat so far for Donald Trump in terms of withholding some of this testimony from Jack Smith. I wonder what you make, and if you could just take me through what your colleagues are reporting today about where things stand for Jack Smith.
Yeah, so what we're seeing is witnesses finally have to testify, and it gives Jack Smith an opportunity to create the fullest account we have seen of the events leading up to January 6th and the former president's role in those events. Now, keep in mind, for the J6 committee, they did a great job of knitting together a narrative, but they were not able to compel all of the witnesses they might have wanted to speak to actually come in and talk to the panel. So Jack Smith has basically continued to do that in court, and it doesn't seem like anything's going to stop him because Donald Trump has continued to lose these battles. So where that takes us is inside Jack Smith's investigation. And we have reported a little bit on this before. I think other outlets have as well. In terms of his style, he is extremely thorough. So what he's apt to do is he has prosecutors on his team present arguments in front of the group, and then the group tries to shoot them down, tries to tear them apart. In terms of best practices, everything he does is with an eye toward a jury trial. So he's extremely aggressive in trying to poke holes in arguments, trying to say, where are we weak on the evidence? Because he is not looking at this as a legal question per se. I mean, he's looking at it as a legal question. Of course, he wants to win, and he wants to win a trial, and he wants to convince jurors. And so this is where he's going to start taking his team as they gather as much evidence, narrative evidence, witness evidence as possible.
Andrew Weissman, that sounds like the way people described you before you were available to us as a commentator and analyst as you were preparing to go to trial. The Manafort case. I mean, I'm going to go run the tape and see if I can find descriptions just like that. I don't want to let the moment past, though, where the Times is able to report, and I think we had some of this conversation with Glenn Thrush and Mike Schmidt earlier in the week, that is evidenced by where the legal battles that are underway, and again, we don't know everything that's going on in court, it's secret, but as evidenced by what the fights are at this point, how and when and whether Pence testifies, it's clear that a whole lot of fact-finding that we don't know about has already gone on. What is your take first on where the tea leaves suggest Jack Smith is?
Let me first say I completely agree with Katie. I think that is exactly what Jack is doing. And he is very much looking at this in terms of getting this indicted and to trial. I think it's really important for everyone to remember the time clock. And I think that is pressing on Jack. The idea that he would do all of this, bring a case, but in such a late time frame that it's too close to the election is the kind of thing that I think he is thinking there's no way he wants that to happen. So I think he is really trying to race to the finish, but to do that responsibly. Now, he's helped by the fact that the January 6th committee gave him a huge running start. They obviously did a lot of work, but as Katie correctly said, there was a whole bunch of witnesses that they could not get to. And he's doing exactly what you want, which is put them in the grand jury and lock them in by their own words, under oath, recorded by a court reporter that is a grand jury court reporter, so that they can't later say the FBI got it wrong and that's not what I said. So he's doing everything by the book in, I think, the most aggressive but also thorough way, but with a real eye on the clock. And I think that's why people are thinking this is coming to a decision one way or the other. I think that decision will be to go forward with respect to both of those federal cases.
So let me just ask you what the clock looks like to a prosecutor.
So that's, look, that's a hard question. I certainly don't want to use the word imminent because, that's obviously stretched quite a bit. But if we are having this conversation in the summer, I think that Jack Smith is going to be thinking, how am I going to get that to trial? He knows that it can take a year to get to trial if he brings the cases in D.C. And so every day that he has to wait, and obviously I think he will wait, of course, to have Mike Pence in the grand jury, but I think he's going to prevail on that, I think, in a matter of, if not hours, days. But I think after that, I think we're going to see that there may be very little else for him to do before he brings charges, certainly with respect to Mar-a-Lago, which is a pretty clean and narrow set of facts.
When you see, Andrew, the parade, they've been described as a parade this week of witnesses going in, does the January 6th evidence start to look, we put them in this sort of relative terms for so long, but do you feel like that case is nearing sort of even par in terms of its legal firmness to the Mar-a-Lago case, or is it still your judgment that the documents case is simpler and cleaner?
Well, the documents case is always going to be simpler and cleaner, and thus, for that reason, is sort of one that if you indict, it's going to be easier to convince a judge to have a trial sooner because there's just less for the defense to do, to be prepared to try that case. It does have a classified documents issue that will be somewhat complicated, but certainly in Washington, D.C., that's something the courts are very adept at dealing with. The real issue with the January 6th case isn't the strength of the case. I mean, we all watched the January 6th committee, and obviously that's not a trial, but we had a real sense of the evidence. And I think that's going to be an incredibly strong case. It's just that that's unwieldy. And that's where somebody like Jack Smith has exactly the right tools. The challenge right now for Jack Smith is triage. You can boil the ocean on that case and spend all the time, months and years looking at, for instance, just the fraud allegations. And that's not what this case requires. And that's why Jack is such the right choice for this case, because he knows, this is where you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good in terms of the scope of the case. You can't investigate all of the obstruction that was going on in every state by Donald Trump and his allies. You have to really keep it focused. And so I think that's the real skill set here. And so I think that's happening. But obviously the key question is when. But I think that if we were waiting for months for either of these cases, I think that Jack would view that as somewhat of a defeat, because he knows that that kind of case will be hard to bring to trial before the election.
Charlie, the timing is so interesting. And, you know, the political calendar to politicos, people like you and me, is something totally different than it is for prosecutors who understand the rhythms and the pacing of bringing a trial. And I saw you nodding when I asked about prosecutorial time. What are your thoughts about the calendar?
You know, I was really glad that Andrew was talking about the time here, because it is very, very late. And we have paid a huge price, I think, for all of the failures to hold Donald Trump accountable. It occurred to me, Nicolle, that we were having conversations like this. We've had conversations like this for the last 6 years, waiting for various investigations to come to fruition, speculating about them. And we're paying a tremendous price for the failure of the U.S. Senate to hold him accountable, for the failure of the Republican Party to hold him accountable. And the reality is we're paying a tremendous price for the slow motion Department of Justice investigation, you know, prior to Jack Smith. You know, these charges really do need to be brought sometime this spring, but they needed to be brought maybe last spring. We're coming up on more than two years after January 6th. And, you know, to Andrew's point, it takes a year to come to trial. Well, a year from now, the Republican presidential nomination may already be sewed up. It may already be over. We will be in the heart of the presidential campaign. So we are already up against this deadline. And I do worry about this. I mean, I've heard speculation that Jack Smith really has to come up with something, take some action by the end of spring. Well, it is April 14th, 2023. And so that time clock is now absolutely crucial. I worry that we've waited too long. I think that it's legitimate to be frustrated about the delays, about the slow action of the Department of Justice. But yes, you know, time is pressing. We can really hear time's winged chariot right at our back at the moment.
Yeah, you know, listen, I've asked questions on this show for years about how long it has taken the Merrick Garland Justice Department to turn its criminal scrutiny lens on Donald Trump. Andrew, I want to let you weigh in on this, as the story now is the clock. I mean, to Charlie's point, in a year, we'll have a Republican nominee of the Republican Party. Odds are, if you believe all of the polls together, analyzed most conservatively, it'll be Donald J. Trump. What, in your mind, is the best way to understand why on these cases that have brought, as we just reported, a parade of witnesses that would include the national security officials? Why is this happening now?
So, you know, look, if you're Jack Smith, and frankly, if you're the public looking at this, you know, there's a lot that can be said. And we've talked about this, about Merrick Garland in the time period before the January 6th committee, as to why they weren't doing more with respect to it. But if you're Jack Smith, it's like, that, who cares? That's what happened. You know, he inherited this, and he has to go forward. Just to give maybe some good news, it is conceivable that in relatively short order, don't ask me to say what that time frame is, but in a matter of a few months, we have 4 indictments, you know, 1 in Manhattan, 1 in Georgia, and 2 in Washington, D.C. And you could imagine that 1, 2, 3, possibly all 4 are scheduled before the election. And it also is possible that, although now Donald Trump seems to be doing quite well and is going to use it's remarkable to even say this, use the fact that he's under indictment as a political tool, not something that you think would ever have been said about America. But, you know, he could be on trial in the smaller January 6th case, which is the Georgia case. He could be on trial in the Manhattan case. He could be on trial on the Mar-a-Lago case. All of those could happen because they are more discreet. And so that could really, change the political calculus that he is not actually the Republican nominee. And it also could be that he is, and the certain voters who are behind him see what happens. And he has to win not one time, but 4 times. As a colleague of mine used to say, that's like deciding you're going to play Russian roulette with 4 bullets, not one.
Yeah.
That is going to be a very tough road to hoe.
Katie, this is a different story, but it's not separate from decisions about accountability and fair criticism from the general public, the taxpayers, about the lack of accountability. The individual who was charged with taking and leaking classified documents is being celebrated by the Trump wing of the Republican Party. How do national security questions weigh on this Justice Department?
So that case is so fascinating to me because, first of all, yes, the response that we're seeing from certain Republicans is exactly the opposite of what we would have imagined even 10 years ago when the Republican Party held itself out as the party of national security, very pro-America asserting its power and being able to have these sorts of relationships in private. So this is somewhat fascinating. 2, for the Justice Department, this is an interesting case because it seems like it could be tricky to prove that this is a person who had an intent to harm the national security of the United States of America. It seems like he's a person who wanted to impress other really young men in a chat group, which seems a little bit different. And, that is just, we're in such a different world when that becomes the intent, first of all. Second of all, the bigger question is, why did somebody who was a low-level National Guardsman even have access to these secrets? Another thing the Justice Department will need to drill down on to try to figure out, 1, mitigation strategies, but 2, what exactly happened in the chain of command of this information? And is there anybody else who could have had it? I mean, again, this is a fascinating case politically. We're seeing players we never would have imagined come out celebrating this kind of leak. And then 2, for the Justice Department, it's a whole new world. It's hard to imagine in a different era, a pre-internet era, a pre-social media era of extreme alienation, these sorts of national security secrets being leaked for reasons other than specifically to harm the national security of the United States or to help another nation. So again, this is just all in all a completely fascinating case, and it's going to be something that the Justice Department's National Security Division and other prosecutors will have to consider extremely carefully as they move forward.
Andrew, does a prosecution have to prove that national security was damaged, or does it have to prove that national security is damaged by the leaking of classified documents and the person intended to damage national security by doing so?
So, the motive that the person has is not something that has to be proved. They have to obviously have the knowledge and intent to take the actions they did. So, you taking classified information and disseminating it knowingly, intentionally, as opposed to an accident, that is a crime. And so I'm pretty sure that piece of it is going to be proved. If you happen to do that because you like the Russians or you hate the United States or you just are really immature and are playing a game with your friends, all of that doesn't matter. Those are all reasons why you might have committed the crime. But the real issue is, did you do it knowingly and intentionally versus did you do it, just as a mistake? So I do think that I agree with Katie. This is a fascinating case. But this is an area where I do think that the Justice Department takes this unbelievably seriously. I think particularly given that the Deputy Attorney General is really steeped in national security matters. I think that's why you also saw this Justice Department make the bold decision to do a first ever search of a residence of a former president, a search that was it turns out was totally justified. So I think that if I were the Republicans, the one thing I would have thought is that they might have been able to differentiate the arrest of the person yesterday from what appears to be the case for Donald Trump. I mean, the Justice Department is smart. They're not equivalent cases. There's no evidence that Donald Trump disseminated the documents, at least in the manner that appears to be the case with the individual yesterday. That's the distinction. If you're trying to decide whether one or the other should be prosecuted, it's not to say we agree with the dissemination of classified information. I agree with Liz Cheney. If that's your view, I don't know how you maintain your ability to have access to classified information going forward.
So, Charlie, I started with Katie and Andrew before you and I had this conversation, because these are important legal and journalistic distinctions. In MAGA world, the leader of the movement has taken classified material to Mar-a-Lago and said by thinking it, he has declassified them and that they are, quote, mine. Andrew just said the Justice Department takes this incredibly seriously. Why? Because they're classified documents. And why do we take classified documents seriously? Because it is U.S. national security, is a national interest. Do you know what Tucker Carlson led with last night? Not the national interest. He celebrated the leak of these documents, which endanger the national interest. What people don't want to do, I don't think, when people like you and me ask questions and express, it's not frustration anymore, it's dismay, frankly, with how long it has taken to hold Trump accountable, is acknowledge that the permission structure has been created to break the laws around classified documents. And everybody got the memo on the right. So we can wait till it's buttoned down and we can look at the clock and we can talk about how difficult it is. We can say that the calendar, Merrick Garland got in there and had other priorities. But the damage has been done. A permission structure on the right has been signaled to the entire right wing, where I knew what Tucker Carlson was going to leave with last night. And I could have written Marjorie Taylor Greene's tweet for her, because the damage has been done.
But it's still remarkable, and we really ought to underline the point that you're making here. This is just the latest in a series of transformations on the right. Republicans used to be the party of national security. They used to be the party of law and order. They used to be the party of constitutionalism. They used to think that character matters. And you'll see, one domino after another has fallen in the era of Donald Trump. So, yes, it is predictable what Marjorie Taylor Greene and Tucker Carlson did last night, but it is still remarkable. Someone who clearly has betrayed his oath of office, his military oath, someone who has betrayed his country, someone who has leaked material that is damaging to his country, and they're being celebrated, at least in Marjorie Taylor Greene's, on her part, by somebody who actually sits on the Homeland Security Committee, who does have access to this. And I also agree with Liz Cheney's point here. But this is worthwhile stepping back to say how this party has changed and how many of the things that are happening right now would be inconceivable 5, 6, 7 years ago. To imagine conservative Republicans celebrating someone like this 21-year-old, poster gamer out there who has betrayed his country in this particular way, that somehow that he is a martyr, he is a victim. So we, again, buckle up. We're in a very, very strange circumstance. But this is one of the many ways in which Donald Trump has convinced Republicans to move away from those norms and move away from the rule of law and move away from this expectation that people will behave honorably.
All right, no one's going anywhere. There's much more. When we come back, the once indicted, twice impeached, disgraced ex-president spent 8 hours. Not sure what he spent 8 hours other than golf doing, if anything, lately. But yesterday, he spent 8 hours in a depot. According to the New York Attorney General, he, quote, spoke a lot. Wow. Plus, it is down to the wire in the legal battle over a critically important part of the medical abortion pill prescription. Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito has just issued a ruling preserving temporarily access to mifepristone, at least for the next few days. We'll break all that down for you. Later in the program, mounting calls for an investigation after news broke this week that Clarence Thomas had business dealings with a right-wing mega donor and failed to disclose them. All those stories and more when Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere. This is Nicolle Wallace from MSNBC. Donald Trump became the first ex-president to be arraigned on criminal charges, pleading not guilty to 34 felonies. On MSNBC's new podcast, Prosecuting Donald Trump, legal analysts and veteran prosecutors Andrew Weissman and Mary McCord break down how Alvin Bragg, Fani Willis, and Jack Smith might think about building a case when the defendant happens to be an ex-president. Search for Prosecuting Donald Trump wherever you're listening and follow. As we reported here yesterday, as it was happening, the disgraced ex-president was back in Manhattan to answer a few questions from lawyers at the Office for New York State Attorney General, Letitia James. And we've since learned that He spent the entire day there and with the AG herself in the room for some of it. It was his second deposition for what is now a blockbuster $250 million lawsuit in which AG Letitia James accuses Trump of making more than 200 instances of fraud in his business practices. The questioning lasted nearly 8 hours, during which NBC News has learned the ex-president spoke, quote, a lot. Given that back in August, he pleaded the fifth more than 400 times, it feels significant and rather remarkable that this time his lawyers let it rip, and he did not take the fifth once ahead of a trial scheduled for October. We're back with Katie Benner, Andrew Weissman, and Charlie Sykes. Andrew Weissman, in your view, what gives?
You know, this is one where I think that his lawyers were weighing the competing interests, because remember, this is a civil case. And so the record as it stands is all of the proof that is alluded to in Tish James' extensive civil complaint is something that can be presented to the judge. In addition, she could use the former president's assertion of the Fifth Amendment, because it's a civil case, that gives her sort of a leg up. It's an added inference that the judge can make because he asserted the Fifth Amendment with respect to these questions. And that's allowed in a civil case, not at all allowed in a criminal case. So for Donald Trump to prevail, he has to come up with something to counter that. And so his now testifying in the discovery phase of the case is a way to take away at least that added inference of the assertion of the fifth, because now it would be very hard for Tish James to argue that to a judge, because he's now answered the questions as to which he previously refused. Presumably that's what happened. The problem is, did he say anything that could help, for instance, Alvin Bragg in his pending financial fraud case? Because remember, he has said that is still pending. And we should also remember, we were all, at least I was, one of the people thinking, okay, when he says that he's still doing this criminal case, is that really true? Or is it something you just say to not, have people yell at you? And it turns out it was true. And now he is saying there still is that financial case. So, we should take him seriously. So that's the dance there. One tidbit that suggests that Donald Trump may not have done that well is that today, apparently, he made some statement that, oh, you know what, my financial statements, they were even, in fact, we were doing even better than what we put on our financial statements. Well, if that's what he said to Tish James, that's actually part of what her claim was that they were presenting a sort of worse position when they were going to the tax authorities, and they were presenting a better position when they were going to banks trying to get loans. So saying that we actually had financial statements that were inaccurate because we were doing better is actually supportive of her theories. So I was a little surprised that the former president made that statement.
Yeah, and anyone that's read anything that's been written or read a page of Mark Pomerantz's book knows that one of the buckets of conduct that's been under criminal and civil scrutiny now for years, and the Supreme Court got involved in freeing up some of these records. Katie's colleagues at the Times have written extensively about his financial records, is this practice testified to by Michael Cohen of deflating assets for certain purposes and inflating them. So, Katie, it kind of gets us back to something that you and your colleagues have now reported for years about Trump, that in his mind, he's his own best lawyer. He's sort of like the Joe Pesci movie, right? And who's here in defense of Trump? Me, I am, but in reality, it's not such a great legal strategy.
Well, one of the things that we've seen in other investigations is that lawyers were really hesitant to have him speak to prosecutors because he's so hard to keep on message. He contradicts himself. He goes off topic. He reveals random things that perhaps he shouldn't. This makes him somewhat of a nightmare witness. So to your point, the fact that he testified for so long, it is not clear that this is something that's going to be good for him. But also, if you take a step back and look at the context, Trump feels incredibly victimized in this moment. And if he is allowed to speak on his own behalf, he might want to do that. I mean, he's already kind of come out. We expect to see him continue to rail against Alvin Bragg. If Jack Smith indicts him, you can expect him to rail against Jack Smith. But this is a place where he wants to go in and he wants to defend himself. It's not a criminal case, but it is really important to him. It is his money. And this is a situation where this could really be a blow to his business in a huge and devastating way. To have to disgorge any amount of money. I mean, as other guests have come on and talked about, like Tim O'Brien, very famously, he wrote a whole book about this. We don't really know how much money he has. We've never really seen a full financial disclosure. He's always represented himself as a billionaire when he certainly wasn't. We don't actually know how much money the organization has, what they're doing with their assets, and what smoke and mirrors. So this could actually be really quite bad for him. So there's also a desperation around this case because the punishment isn't jail time. The punishment is disgorging millions of dollars to the state of New York, which he may or may not really be in a financial position to do. So this is definitely fascinating to watch, fascinating psychologically to see how it plays out. And if I were his lawyer, of course they're going to come out and say that it was really great that he was able to do this. But knowing what we know about the way he speaks, how discursive he is, his loose relationship to the truth, it's unclear whether or not this is going to be good for him in the end.
I mean, Charlie, it's such a good reminder and some great books and bodies of reporting. And I think Andrew Weissman gets at this in his. I mean, his red line, the thing he never let anyone near other than his hair,
The money.
is his finances. Right. I mean, this is a real trigger.
Yeah. So yesterday, I was actually walking my dog, listening to Andrew on MSNBC talking about the possible nightmare scenario of Donald Trump as a witness. And he used, I think, the key word that one of the things that trips up white collar criminals in cases like this is their hubris. That was you, Andrew, right? I mean, it's the hubris. They're cocky. They are arrogant. They believe they have something to say. And this gets them in a lot of trouble because, they have this incredible confidence that they're able to tell their story and spin it the right way. And this is a civil case. But as Andrew pointed out, you still have Alvin Bragg, who is watching the same set of facts, is watching very carefully. What is Donald Trump saying under oath? What is he giving away? And as Katie mentioned, Donald Trump is really a nightmare witness. So the longer he talks, the greater the possibility that he's going to tell lies, and these would be lies under oath or reveal things that might actually have consequences in a criminal trial that he doesn't fully understand. But I think that this is one of those moments where Donald Trump's arrogance and his hubris might be very, very dangerous for him.
It's so interesting. When you hear 8 hours, I kind of just thought it was a head scratcher. But to the points you're all making, if he's talking, you might have savvy prosecutors that just say, go on, tell me more. Yes. Fascinating week of developments. Katie Benner, Andrew Weissman, Charlie Sykes, thank you all so much for starting us off today. Up next for us, the Supreme Court could be on the verge of making its most consequential decision to date on abortion since overturning Roe v. Wade with its Dobbs decision. We'll bring you up to date on all of that next.
Voters are already outraged by anti-choice extremists' dogged attacks on their reproductive freedom, and every baseless ruling steeped in dangerous disinformation and total disregard for our law and democracy only adds fuel to the fire.
It's a familiar face to all of us. That was Mini Timuraju, the president of NARAL Pro-Choice America, outside the United States Supreme Court this morning, calling on justices to block a ruling from an appeals court that would severely curtail access to the most commonly used and safest abortion and miscarriage management drug. The protests there reflect the fact that this case has quickly made its way through the courts, all the way to the country's highest court. And just hours after that protest we're showing you right now on your screen, Justice Samuel Alito, the author of the Dobbs decision, stripping away the constitutional right to an abortion, placed a temporary hold for just a few days on that appeals court ruling, keeping mifepristone widely accessible for now. Joining us now, President of NARAL Pro-Choice America, Mini Timuraju, who, as you just saw, spoke at the rally at the Supreme Court today. Plus, MSNBC medical contributor Dr. Kavita Patel is back. And Dahlia Lithwick is here with us at the table, legal correspondent and senior editor for Slate, host of the Amicus podcast, as well as an MSNBC law and politics analyst. Mini, it's so exciting to have you fresh off this protest, but I can barely decipher the legal tectonic pieces today, so I'm going to start with you, Dahlia. Alito's stay puts on hold the Amarillo judge's ruling for a few days. Is that right?
That's right. And the ruling that upheld a part of that, the Fifth Circuit ruling that came down at midnight last night, essentially the clock was ticking down to Saturday when something was meant to happen. This is an administrative stay. It essentially is just a pause. And what it says is we've got until midnight Wednesday. Parties are going to have to file some briefs, and we're going to figure this out. So it's not a ruling on the merits. It's not even a hat tip of what Justice Alito thinks, but it is a signal that the court, although it pretends not to listen to what Minnie's saying out there on the plaza, is at least listening to something about how it needs to get involved.
Minnie, take me inside your message today and just speak to the depth and breadth. I mean, the new polling on abortion is stunning, even for those who believe it should be, even more universally supported right for half of our population than it is. You got 51% of all Republicans who believe that the ruling banning mifepristone was politically motivated, close to 70% of all Democrats. At a policy level and a legal level, this smells political and corrupt, and it is wildly unpopular.
So the message we were delivering today at the court was this case should have never been heard. It completely is without merit. It's without standing. It's so outrageous and extremist. The court has every responsibility to hear it. But the stay today, as Dahlia said, it's just temporary relief, if you could even call it that. We need this court to outright, frankly, dismiss this case. It doesn't have merit. So, and as you pointed out, public opinion is well on our side. One of the things we're doing as a movement, Planned Parenthood, ACLU, NARAL, and our allies, is we've launched a people's petition to the court just to show and emphasize how much public support there is for medication abortion. And we're also using this as an opportunity to underscore the challenges with the credibility of this court. It's not shocking, but quite alarming that this is all happening at the same time that this news is breaking about Clarence Thomas and his serious ethical complications with this court, taking gifts from a mega donor. And we have to raise the alarm that this court's credibility is under question, and they better do what's right, or we're going to call on Congress to make it right.
We're going to drill all the way down on the latest reporting. It's unbelievable. And Dahlia has a brand new piece of analysis on the crisis at the Supreme Court. I just don't want to get any further, though, without talking about what this means today, Dr. Patel, for a woman seeking reproductive health care. I want to read a little bit from the Justice Department's appeal. They write this: the FDA is caught in the middle here between the Fifth Circuit and the Washington State judge's ruling, putting the agency at risk of contempt if it complies with either one. Quote, the abrupt shift in the regulatory landscape that would be required by the lower court's orders has put the FDA in an impossible position. The FDA has spent the last week first grappling with the implications of the district court's order, then racing to untangle the different and enormously more complicated issues raised by the Fifth Circuit's decision. And in the meantime, another district court has enjoined FDA from doing anything to change the conditions on the distribution of mifepristone in 17 states and the District of Columbia, which means that the FDA risks contempt if it takes action to permit the marketing of mifepristone in a manner consistent with the Fifth Circuit's order. Completely caged in by the dysfunction and the extremism in the courts. What happens inside a doctor's office between a patient and a doctor right now?
Yeah, what's happening right now is that a lot of my colleagues aren't necessarily keeping up with the fact that the Supreme Court has put in a stay. So many of us were under an assumption that as of Saturday at 1 a.m., we were rolling back to the kind of pre-2020 standards that we had for mifepristone prescribing, which was that we couldn't put it in the mail. You had to have an in-person visit. There were a lot more restrictions that took place just several years ago. Many of us just kind of assumed, and sadly, Nicolle, I have to say this, I actually was a little relieved that that was the outcome, because we were facing an alternative where we weren't able to prescribe it at all. And isn't it amazing how much those of us that know the science, 23 years of science that supports the use of this drug, and also just talking through, we've been talking about abortions. I just want to remind people 1 in 5 pregnancies end in miscarriage. We've talked about the fact that we use this drug for many different purposes. Taking that away is just denying women a humane way to kind of go through the medical system. And so what's happening now is just complete, because of the controversy and the chaos, it's confusing providers. And there's a significant number of us who are probably going to recoil and resist prescribing out of fear. So because the right has made it very scary to prescribe this, or has made it seem like it is illegal. Today, it is not illegal. And as you heard and Dahlia has explained, this is something that we have just a temporary stay for. But as clinics are unfolding and people need medical care, Nicolle, the real world is hitting us in the face where people just don't know what to do. And that results in missed opportunities to give women the care they deserve.
So much of this is designed to do what Dr. Patel just said, right? The extreme right has totally hijacked policy and politics on abortion, and the Supreme Court is complicit in overturning a right held for 50 years. That's why it's now political deadweight on the Republican Party. And that's why you have Republicans like this one who's talking about running for president, incapable of getting like a noun and a verb together to explain his position on an abortion ban at 6 weeks. Let me play Tim Scott.
So every time a state, of course, adopts a decision, states have the ability to have the most conservative bills that they can get passed in their legislature. I support the culture of life, without question.
But is 6 weeks the right mile marker?
Well, the people have decided that their elected leaders have the opportunity to do so. So I say absolutely. As the culture of life is being protected, we should celebrate that. States will have different varying views on that. But yes, if I were president of the United States, I would literally sign the most conservative pro-life legislation that they can get through Congress.
Even if it was 6 weeks?
I'm not going to talk about 6 or 5 or 7 or 10. I'm just saying that whatever the most conservative legislation is that can come through Congress.
Just sank his ability to ever be the president of these United States. Let me just say something about this language. And no one should allow Republicans to use this culture of life. You know who supports a culture of life? A woman who has a miscarriage and has sepsis, and that's why she's in the hospital. She supports a culture of life, too, the life she was carrying. This is not about life. This is about extreme and politically corrupted politics on the right that has brought us to a point where what he just said is in violation of where a plurality of Republicans are right now.
Kavita made such an interesting point about the Overton window here, right? A year ago, we were gobsmacked that Dobbs was happening. Judge Kaczmarek's order from Amarillo made Dobbs look reasonable and centrist. And what the Fifth Circuit did made Dobbs look reasonable and centrist. We are watching the Overton window shifting in front of our eyes. And the amazing thing is that it is having no effect on the discourse. People are not moving. They are, as you said at the beginning, becoming angrier and angrier and angrier.
The numbers right now of people who support abortion in all or most instances are at historic highs.
Yep.
Minnie, what are you seeing? And again, women are suffering. Women will die. This is not healthcare. This is not part of being equal citizens in the American experiment. And we will never stop paying attention to that. But the politics are catastrophic for the Republican Party today.
Tim Scott's remarks were just remarkable in their bumblingness, if that's a word. I mean, I was astounded. He's pretty experienced as a statesperson, but it tells you so much. It tells you how in disarray the GOP is about positions, as I've said before on the show, they have espoused for decades. I mean, Tim Scott has been the honoree of Susan B. Anthony list. He's been an unabashed defender of extremist anti-choice organizations and movements. And now he's stumbling because he sees the same polling you showed us. So look, I think this culture of life thing, you nailed it. It's just laughable at this point. And what's astounding is the American people have broke through. A year ago, if you and I were talking about this, and I think we were, the Dobbs effect really closed the believability gap for the abortion rights movement. We had a believability gap. People did not believe Roe would be overturned. Now it's completely flipped on its head, and it's because you're telling the stories, the devastating stories of real life people and the impact it has, and people's eyes are opening.
And it is so central to people's real world experiences as men and women, as families. I want to come back to that on the other side of a very short break. Minnie, Dr. Patel, and Dahlia are all sticking around. Don't go anywhere.
Each week on Why Is This Happening?, MSNBC's Chris Hayes is joined by uniquely qualified guests to dig deeper into today's most pressing issues and ask, why is this happening? And fans are loving what they're hearing.
I love that Chris isn't afraid to not know the answer to the things he's asking about.
I've listened to so many that have made me cry, and some that have, they make me laugh.
Whenever his wife, Kate, is on, because she's brilliant, and he can't stop showing just how obsessed he is with her, and I love it.
I've received both of my vaccines plus my booster, but it's in fact the Chris Hayes shot in the arm I receive each week that I am convinced keeps my mind and body running smoothly.
I like to use WithPod as a zero commitment book club.
Why Is This Happening? The Chris Hayes Podcast. New episodes every Tuesday. Subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts.
Minnie Timaraji, Dr. Kavita Patel, and Dahlia Lithwick are back with us. So, Dr. Patel, what happens? What happens this weekend? What happens next week? How is information shared? Or do patients, you said doctors can't even keep track of this. What's happening to women in America?
Yeah, what's happening are some premature kind of advisories from specific hospitals and clinics. I've actually seen some of the emails that have gone around because of confusion, even in clinical leadership at many places, where they've interpreted Kazmarik's decision as the elimination of an option to use this drug whatsoever. That was incorrect. And then the Fifth Circuit, and then the interpretation. So we've had a lot of people deciphering this in the incorrect manner. And what's happening kind of at the ground level, I'll be honest, is that many of us are wondering, can we stockpile some of these drugs? Are we able to prescribe them and let people hold on to them in case they need to use them because they can get them filled today? And then I think the other conversation that's happening, as I've mentioned before, is that we're all kind of training ourselves on what happens in a universe where we only have one of the two drug regimens, misoprostol, which is kind of usually the second drug in this medication abortion regimen, or one that we would use in a miscarriage, and getting women ready for the fact that we have not necessarily wanted to do this, but it's what we have left, and how to give them advice on when they need to come back to the doctor, when they need to call us, if in what we expect will happen, that this does not fully help them go through the process the way a two-drug regimen would do. So in short, we're preparing for the worst and we're hoping that we never have to live that reality. But Nicolle, each day it feels like that's more and more becoming the reality. And then just medically speaking, it's what I said, many of us as physicians are pretty risk averse, advanced practitioners, and a number of people will just fade away and not want to prescribe any of these drugs, whether they're legal or not, because of the fear of what could happen to them. And you see that in states that have severely restricted abortions and made this criminal against physicians.
Which is an unbelievable moment. Your voices are so vital to understanding it. Minnie Timaraji, Dr. Kavita Patel, thank you so much. Dahlia Lithwick sticks around into the next hour. Coming up for us in the next hour of Deadline White House, how Justice Clarence Thomas's failure to disclose his ties with a conservative billionaire is dealing yet another blow to the Supreme Court's reputation. That story's next after a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
To have the Attorney General come in and do a report that sets the facts out so that he can pursue a civil fine is very important. Setting aside the fine, it's not a big number, but the fact of an investigation is really important and potentially a spur to Chief Justice Roberts to do what he should have done all along, which is to provide a mechanism for investigating allegations about Supreme Court justices.
Hi again, everybody. It's now 5 o'clock in New York. In the wake of that remarkable new reporting by ProPublica that Justice Clarence Thomas was not only gifted lavish vacations for more than 2 decades by his billionaire buddy, but that same friend also purchased property from him, none of which was publicly disclosed by Justice Thomas. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, a longtime advocate for establishing a Supreme Court code of conduct, has called for an investigation by the U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland, saying that if the justices of the highest court will not police themselves, then somebody else needs to do it. We covered it on this program at this hour yesterday, the astonishing new reporting that Justice Thomas's billionaire buddy and Republican megadonor Harlan Crow had purchased the house that Thomas's mother lived in and still lives in 9 years ago, along with other lots on the same street in Savannah, Georgia. It marks the first known instance of money flowing from Crow to Justice Thomas. Thomas did not respond to ProPublica's questions. Senator Whitehouse and law experts argue that Justice Thomas has broken the Ethics in Government Act of 1978 that says that property exceeding $1,000 needs to be disclosed. Now, questions of illegality aside, Justice Clarence Thomas's conduct amounts to a stunning breach of public trust in an institution that relies entirely on the American public being confident that its justices put the law and their own integrity above everything else. These revelations come at a time when the court has seen its approval from the public plunge in recent years. As Jamal Bowie writes in an op-ed in the New York Times today, quote, the only remedy to the problem of the court's corruption, to say nothing of its power, is to subject it to the same checks and limits we associate with the other branches. The court may adjudicate disputes within the constitutional order, but it does not exist above or outside its reach. In practice, this means the Democratic Party will have to abandon its squeamishness about challenging and shaping the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary. Whether it is through structural change or a simple ethics code, it is up to elected officials to remind the court that it serves the republic and not the other way around. CREW, the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington group, has also filed a civil and criminal complaint against Thomas. Their chief ethics counsel, Virginia Cantor, tells ProPublica this, quote, he needed to report his interest in the sale. Given the role Crow has played in subsidizing the lifestyle of Thomas and his wife, you have to wonder if this was an effort to put cash in their pockets. This is where we begin the hour with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Joining us now, Barbara McQuaid, former U.S. attorney, now a law professor at the University of Michigan. And Dahlia Lithwick is still with us at the table, legal correspondent and senior editor for Slate. Barbara and Dahlia are both MSNBC contributors. Dahlia, you've got an amazing new piece up. I'm going to read as much of it as I can while I have you here at the table. You write this. Under the rules around the undisclosed luxury travel reported last week, ProPublica could not find a single ethics expert willing to squint and hop on one foot in a way that would make the failure to report the real estate transaction as arguably lawful. The court has not responded in any way to the latest revelations. Defenders of Justice Thomas somehow continue to urge that this is a smear campaign by liberals. No liberals around on the Crow super yacht, right? That's ridiculous.
It's been such an interesting illustration of the tribalism that has come to infect this conversation, that the idea that the Wall Street Journal op-ed page was saying this is the left-leaning ProPublica, it's a smear on Justice Thomas. He broke the law. There's no dispute that he broke the law. If you want to defend him on the merits for breaking the law by saying he's too awesome to disclose, say he's too awesome to disclose. The notion that these watchdog groups and that journalists are doing the work of digging up truly shocking conflicts and that it's being defended as, well, you just hate Justice Thomas is kindergarten stuff.
And let me just assure everyone and anyone that if anything came out that Justice Kagan or Justice Sotomayor were doing anything unethical, I mean, if we put the Jim Jordan fake politicization committee to shame, there'd be congressional hearings in about 15 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem here is that, you know, we get hung up on these micro stories, right? I don't really care about the RV and the fact that he's not a man of the people. I don't really care, quite honestly, about Harlan Crow's, like, napkins that are embroidered with Nazi insignias. That's not the point. The point is that Clarence Thomas's mom has Harlan Crow for a landlord. And that's not okay. It means that in a deep, deep way, somebody who has poured millions of dollars into groups that argue before the court, into keeping justices off the court, into putting other justices onto the court, also has a material role in Clarence Thomas's financial life. And if you want to live that way, but disclose it.
Why does Justice Roberts continue to do nothing?
I mean, I think the formal answer is there's nothing he can really do. He's not the boss of the other justices. His, job.
The boss of the institution, though. He could demand an ethics let's be honest about codes of conduct. Sometimes they're meaningless, but they at least look like something more than nothing.
The most striking example that I've seen that a Chief Justice can actually do a lot if he wants to put the interest of the institution above his parochial interest is the ouster of Abe Fortas. Chief Justice Earl Warren helped with that, and that was with the Nixon White House driving it. That was a liberal pushing a liberal off the court. By the way, Democrats in the Senate were outraged by Justice Fortas's conduct, which is nothing compared to what we're seeing from Thomas.
You just broke Google, right? Literally everybody, including Justice Roberts, is Googling this chapter in history. Do you think there's any chance? I mean, your first point is probably the most profound, that our politics are so tribal. No one thinks there's any chance that Roberts would seek to oust Thomas.
I think that the fact that Thomas issued a statement last week after the first ProPublica story signals that he is capable of understanding he's in trouble. I think the fact that the Judicial Conference, which is the governing body of the court, quietly closed that loophole a few weeks ago, the travel loophole, means that that's how it's going to change. I don't think anybody believes that there is going to be a moment at which the court says, we're kind of unethical and we should adopt a code of ethics. That's too much to ask. But I will say all this other stuff in the ether, everything that's going on with the abortion case, all the other cases, the court is so behind on issuing opinions. The mistrust in the building, all of that stuff is shaped by fundamentally the court knowing it is in a deeply adversarial posture with the country.
What is the ability of anybody inside the bubble, because it is very clear that not you, but we are on the outside of the bubble, to say, it's not us, it's you. When you issue a decision that puts you on the other side of 70% of all Americans and 93% of the female ones, you're going to be a plagued institution. When you say the leak of that document endangers the lives of the conservative justices and then you appoint the mall cop to investigate, people don't believe you. You sound like you're crying wolf. And when you uphold laws that govern all of the rest of us in ethical ways, but don't abide by them, we think you're full of it. What is their ability to have that conversation amongst themselves?
I don't think it's high, but I think this is why the Clarence Thomas Harlan Crow story is really salient in this moment. And this is not trivial, but it's kind of technical. Clarence Thomas has sat on the U.S. Supreme Court when it decided Citizens United, when it decided Shelby County, when it decided Rucho, the gerrymandering case. These aren't just like Clarence Thomas's politics. This is the erosion of democracy's ability to function. This is the erosion of one person, one vote. This is the erosion of the principle that, as it was said by Alito in the Dobbs opinion, if you don't like this, vote. It turns out people are voting that they don't like it, and so the court is participating in making it harder to vote. I think the thing that is really scary undergirding all of this is that the same court that we're criticizing right now is making democracy more and more broken and unstable. The polarization we started the conversation with, the court's got a thumb on the scale for that.
Yeah, and I want to bring Barbara McQuaid in on this. The public feeling that the court is a political institution, it's not us being emotional. I mean, Roe and Casey are decided by justices appointed by Democrats and Republicans. The right to an abortion is taken away by 6 right-wing justices who sort of have the hubris in what they write to say, and we're coming for others too. What is your sense of where the court stands first? And then I want to ask you about an ethics code.
Well, I agree with you, Nicolle. That Dobbs decision was really something in that the basis for the decision wasn't founded on normal reasons for overturning precedent. It was based on the opinion of Justice Alito that Roe was, quote, egregiously wrong. That is the exact opposite way that justices are supposed to overturn precedent. They're supposed to look at factors like, has the public relied on this? Has it proved to be unworkable in practice? Is it inconsistent with other cases that have been decided since that time? The answer to all of those questions was consistent with upholding Roe versus Wade. Instead, they rejected all those traditional tests and just substituted their own opinion for the Roe court, which is not the way precedent is supposed to work. And so I think the argument that it was a nakedly political decision is one that lands as true because of the method that they used to overturn Roe.
And what do you make of the sort of inability to do anything in line with institutional norms on ethics, and for what few limits they have? And we should say that what Clarence Thomas has done is in violation of the court's own rather lenient ethics.
Yeah, ethics rules matter, Nicolle, and the reason they matter is, we don't set the standard as long as it's not criminal, it's okay. Because what matters in government is that we have public trust. And that's where ethics rules come in. They require disclosure for transparency reasons. They require recusal when someone has a conflict of interest. And all of those things are to promote public trust. They're also there to deter people from taking gifts. If I know I have to disclose it, maybe I won't go on the fancy super yacht because I know that'll look bad. So I'll decline those gifts. So ethics rules really matter. And I think that one of the real damaging things we have seen since the Trump era is this destruction of norms and things. As long as it's not illegal, then go ahead and do it. And so ethics rules, I think, are really important for this court. The argument against it is simply that this would compromise their separation of powers, that the court is a separate and independent branch from the others. But all the others have checks and balances. I mean, the executive has to abide by these kinds of rules about ethics disclosures. The legislature has to do it. Why not the court, where the decision-making power of the court is arguably more powerful than anybody else's? And so I don't think that that is a valid reason. I think we could come up with meaningful ethics standards that have teeth, that would hold the court accountable as it is facing this deep suspicion by members of the public of their compromised situation when it comes to politics.
Let me bring into our coverage Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut. He's a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. I want to read something you tweeted out this morning. Quote, "It just keeps getting worse. Justice Thomas's reported failure to disclose that a billionaire benefactor bought his family house and renovated it, the renovations get me too, is outrageous and likely illegal. These rolling revelations are exactly why an investigation is necessary." I agree with you, but tell me what an investigation looks like and how it happens.
First, I believe that Justice Thomas should resign. The unavoidable, sickening stain of this appearance of impropriety, let alone what he actually has done, are really undermining trust and credibility in the whole judiciary. You started the show by talking about the damage to the Supreme Court. Well, it's the entire judiciary that is in peril here. And remember, the Supreme Court has no armies, no police force. What it has is trust and credibility. The judiciary itself ought to do an investigation through something like an inspector general. It could be appointed by the Judicial Conference, which is headed by Chief Justice Roberts. My colleague, Senator Whitehouse and Representative Johnson, have urged that this issue be referred to the Department of Justice. My preference would be for the judiciary to clean up its own mess and address wrongdoing in its own ranks. But if it fails to do so, and if the Department of Justice fails to start an investigation, I think Congress must act.
Senator, do you get any sense from Roberts or anyone around him that he has personally reached a tipping point?
Great question. I will say, having been a law clerk on the United States Supreme Court and having argued a number of cases there while I was Attorney General of Connecticut, that the court is sometimes inscrutable, but there is pressure on the court from lower court judges who have to be absolutely aghast and appalled. The entire judiciary of the United States lives by a code of ethics that doesn't apply to the United States Supreme Court. And they have been following this code of ethics. The Supreme Court has put itself above the law, in fact, by refusing to have a code of ethics. And I have to believe that Chief Justice Roberts is hearing from those lower court judges on courts of appeals and trial judges, even from members of his own party. What in God's name is going on here? There has to be a line that can't be crossed. And Justice Clarence Thomas has clearly crossed it by taking money. Remember, these weren't luxury travels or trips, not private planes, and not even the non-disclosure, which is itself a potential violation of criminal law. We're talking here about money changing hands, overpayment for property. His mother continuing to live in a house, maybe rent-free, but certainly at a higher value than would be the sale on the market. And this is kind of sordid and gross in a way that we haven't seen in the United States Supreme Court in history, certainly not in recent history, Abe Fortas notwithstanding.
So I don't have any friends that are billionaires, but in a close relationship, buying your mother's home usually isn't the first move, right? I mean, do you want to know what else Crow and Thomas are entangled with financially? Ginny Thomas is a very, very active political activist on the far right ledge of right-wing politics. I mean, how do you get, for an ethics purpose, a full accounting of where all the places are that Crow's money has flowed into the Thomases? We only know about this because it's property in their tax and deed records.
You know, there's a saying for us who were prosecutors, follow the money. That's what an inspector general for the Judicial Conference would do. Look at records of both Justice Thomas and his wife. On one of his disclosure forms, he put in the box for spouse income none, when in fact his wife received payments from Republican leadership in the House, from the Heritage Foundation, from other sources. That kind of misstatement, along with other false record keeping submitted to the United States government, is a violation of the Ethics in Government Act, along with non-disclosure of those kinds of payments. So there is a well-established means of accountability here through a Judicial Conference investigation involving a prosecutorial figure like an inspector general. Other agencies have them. They do this kind of investigation. So do local prosecutors. When a developer seeking a permit from the local building authorities for one of his developments pays for improvements on some office holder's home, local prosecutors develop it and as a criminal case and investigate it. There is nothing magic here about the kind of investigation that has to be done. But what's key, Nicolle, as you have pointed out, is accountability, whether it's through the Department of Justice investigating or through the Judicial Conference having something like an inspector general, or Congress itself, potentially through impeachment proceeding. Initiating this kind of investigation. It cries out for the facts such as those you've just mentioned.
And if DOJ and an IG are not viable, are you calling for an impeachment proceeding for Justice Thomas?
I'm very clear-eyed about the likelihood of Justice Thomas resigning or about an impeachment proceeding beginning in a Republican-dominated Congress, House of Representatives, Judiciary Committee led by Jim Jordan. Unlikely, to be sure, but there certainly should be consideration of it.
I mean, just one more thing about the politics of all this. I want to play something that Justice Sotomayor said about the stench, because she was talking about something different, about a process where a supermajority in a state house legislates in a way designed to be met and received in one way by the Supreme Court. But it's illustrative of how the public sees the Supreme Court. Let me play that.
Now, the sponsors of this bill, the House bill in Mississippi, said we're doing it because we have new justices. The newest ban that Mississippi has put in place, the 6-week ban, the Senate sponsor said we're doing it because we have new justices on the Supreme Court. Will this institution survive the stench that this creates in the public perception that the Constitution and its reading are just political acts? I don't see how it is possible.
Last night, after 11 p.m. in the state of Florida, Ron DeSantis signed a 6-week abortion ban into law without much fanfare, knowing perhaps of its deep unpopularity with men, women, Democrats, and Republicans in the state of Florida. Do you want to take a stab at answering Justice Sotomayor's question? Can the Supreme Court stand the stench of states with Republican supermajorities legislating for a certain outcome in the Supreme Court?
It has to withstand the challenge, and there have to be some bipartisan agreements. Nicolle, for the sake of our government, this system of checks and balances is vital to sustaining public basic confidence and trust in our system of government. And the court itself has to put some reins on its politicization. There has been a kind of political hardening of arteries here, a blame the messenger mentality that the American public is willing to just go to its corners. But the Supreme Court survives on credibility and trust. And Chief Justice Roberts knows it better than anyone. That's why his taking action now, right now, is so vital to the court's survival of this stench, which is growing and will infect the entire body politic. The Supreme Court has no other means of enforcement than people's belief that it is trying to do the right thing, that justices are not politicians in robes. They are really keepers of the public trust, and they've fallen a lot more than anybody ever thought they would right now. And as someone with deep respect for the institution, having worked in it and having argued before it, I am so deeply saddened, angry, but still believing we can turn it around.
Senator Richard Blumenthal, thank you very much for spending time with us today on that. Dahlia, I'll give you the last word.
I just want to maybe re-up what feels like it's been a theme in this entire conversation from the beginning, talking about Donald Trump to what the senator just said, which is the law is not a set of party favors. It's not a thing that you use to club your enemies like Alvin Bragg. It's not a thing you use to exculpate Donald Trump or Clarence Thomas because they're too important to be held to it. And what Senator Blumenthal said that I think is just so resoundingly important is that if we don't have a legitimate Supreme Court, we don't have the rule of law.
And that it has to survive.
Yep.
You know, that it has to. Barbara McQuay, Dahlia Lithwick, thank you so much for being part of this conversation. We'll stay on it. When we come back, a really important story. The parents of Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich speaking out for the very first time since their son was arrested and detained in Russia. The Biden administration says he's being wrongfully detained there. What will it take to bring him home, and how long will that take? After a short break, Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
This is Nicolle Wallace from MSNBC. Donald Trump became the first ex-president to be arraigned on criminal charges, pleading not guilty to 34 felonies. On MSNBC's new podcast, Prosecuting Donald Trump, legal analysts and veteran prosecutors Andrew Weissman and Mary McCord break down how Alvin Bragg, Fani Willis, and Jack Smith might think about building a case when the defendant happens to be an ex-president. Search for Prosecuting Donald Trump wherever you're listening and follow.
What's one of the American qualities that we absorbed? Be optimistic, believe in happy ending. That's where we stand right now. But I am not stupid. I understand what's involved, but that's what I choose to believe.
Wow. That was Ella Millman. She's the mom of detained Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, speaking out alongside other members of his family for the very first time since her son was arrested and detained on March 29th. This week, the State Department formally designated that the 31-year-old American is being wrongfully detained after he was charged with espionage by the Russians. However, today, possibly some optimistic news, as Gershkovich's mom was speaking about just there. The Kremlin is signaling through state media that Russia may be willing to discuss a potential prisoner swap involving Gershkovich after the court delivers a ruling in his case. Joining us now, the journalist who spoke with his parents, Wall Street Journal senior video reporter Shelby Holliday. Also joining us, former CIA Director John Brennan and former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul. These interviews are heartbreaking. I'm going to play some more of them, but tell me I'm always amazed and always wonder where the strength comes from in the moment when it's your child.
I don't know where it comes from, but these people are incredibly strong. They're going through a lot. There are a lot of emotions. They're overwhelmed, but I would say strong is the word, that best describes them. His mom said, I'm here. I don't want to fall apart. We also need to stand strong for our son.
Right.
They are optimistic. They emigrated to the U.S. from the Soviet Union, and you heard her say that's something we absorbed by being Americans. We choose to believe in happy endings.
Yeah.
But they understand the reality of the situation. They're devastated their son is behind bars, but they're just deeply moved, too, by all of the support they're getting. She talked a lot about what it means to be an American and how special it is to have this community rallying around you. The journalism community, the Jewish community, the Christian community, they feel the love. They feel all of it.
What is it like for you to have one of your colleagues doing what you do every day, his job?
It's terrifying. It's terrifying. And he's very good at his job. He was the reporter who would always hop on the phone, help us translate Russian, give us a better understanding of the country, One thing his sister said was he always saw Russia with such beauty and nuance. He grew up speaking Russian. He grew up immersed in the Russian culture. He was a bridge. His colleagues describe him as this bridge for people in the West to really have a better understanding of the people there. We talk about the regime, but the people. And he gave such a great voice to those people. So it's heartbreaking, and we miss his byline every day.
I want to play some more of your interview. I think this is the sister.
What was it like for you to read about Russia through his reporting?
I'm just in awe of him. We're so different. I'm a homebody. He's a thrill seeker, an adventurer. I can't even relate to him sometimes in the life he leads as a reporter. I think the America reports on Russia sometimes in a way that makes it seem like a pretty terrifying, cold place. He was really passionate about showing other sides to Russia, the nuance and the beauty of it.
So profound.
It is. And he really was dedicated to that. We talked to his parents about some of the stories. He wrote a wide range of stories. He profiled Kremlin supporters, people who oppose the war. He talked about, the powerful people in Russia and the everyday people in Russia. And he saw the difference, and he gave the Russians a voice. And that's a voice that we don't often hear in the U.S. So that's something his family is very proud of, and of course, hoping he can get out soon. One thing his father said in the interview, too, is I believe his mom said he loved Russia, and his dad said he still does. He still does. That's not changing, right? Yeah.
So, the ironies are so layered, Director Brennan. Here's someone who may have been one of Russia's best opportunities in this country at one of its most prominent media outlets to tell a fuller story about the Russian people. And it's treating him, as the State Department has designated, they've wrongfully detained him. What is your sense? What is your analysis of, one, how he's being treated today, and two, the prospects for his return?
Well, as you pointed out, Nicolle, I think Evan certainly is a brilliant journalist, and he was really able to capture the essence of Russian society, culture, the country itself for his readers. And it's unsurprising in some respects that Mr. Putin has decided to move against Evan, because Mr. Putin, just like other autocrats, fears the truth, fears the media, fears the press, because they uncover the truth. And I'm sure that Evan now is being used by the Russians as a way to try to say that he was spying, but he certainly is not involved in any type of espionage. He was involved in good reporting, good journalism, doing what all good reporters are supposed to do, which is why Mr. Putin, I think, decided to move against him. So I'm hoping that he is being treated well and fairly. And I know that our government is doing all it can to try to get him released. But again, this is just a reflection of Mr. Putin's brazen and continued authoritarian rule.
As if we needed more of those. Ambassador McFaul, you and I have had a lot of conversations around the men and women wrongfully detained by Vladimir Putin. And there's no sameness at all. But there is a clear use by Putin of this as a weapon. Tell me what you think of the specifics of this case. And again, how you think we should understand what we can't see, what the government's doing behind the scenes to bring him home.
Well, I'd say two things. A lot of people are already talking about who should be traded for Mr. Evan. And we needed another trade. And thankfully, you're reminding that there are already Americans that could have been traded, Paul Whelan and Mark Vogel. With Gershkovich, I think it's really important to underscore what John just said. I've never met him. I've read him for years, even when he was at the Moscow Times. I read the last article that he wrote. It was a great article. I even retweeted it several times. And you know what it was about? It was about how sanctions in Russia, sanctions against Russia, are having an effect on the economy. And he did it with a co-writer. It was one of the best pieces I'd read. And that's exactly what Vladimir Putin doesn't want us to know. And he doesn't want Russians to know about that, too. And I think that's why this is so doubly troubling, right? This is not just about swapping for Russian criminals who are being held in Germany or the United States. This is a signal to anybody that wants to do independent reporting, Russians, Americans, or Europeans or otherwise, that it is dangerous to do so. And it will have a chilling effect. It already has. And they are achieving that objective by arresting Evan.
Is there any re-examining the journal's policy of having journalists do this great reporting inside the country for the risks that it poses to the men and women?
I mean, I can't speak to policies, but I can say that the Journal is not backing down from doing important reporting all over the world. If anything, this makes us more encouraged to uncover the truth and get to the bottom of what's happening. Russia is an interesting place right now. Things are changing, but as far as our reporting goes, there will be no changing on how we go after the truth. And the best thing you can do in honor of Evan is to do that.
It's very nice to see you again at this table. We've missed you. And these are some extraordinary interviews you've done with his family. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for shining a light on it. Thank you so much.
John Brennan, Michael McFaul, we're going to ask you two to stick around. We have a lot more ground to cover. When we come back, the suspect in the intelligence documents leak case was in court today for the first time. And now, speaking up in his defense, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Tucker Carlson, and everyone that follows them on the MAGA right. We'll explain later. Don't go anywhere.
Each week on Why Is This Happening?, MSNBC's Chris Hayes is joined by uniquely qualified guests to dig deeper into today's most pressing issues and ask, why is this happening? And fans are loving what they're hearing.
I love that Chris isn't afraid to not know the answer to the things he's asking about.
I've listened to so many that made me cry and some that have, they make me laugh.
Whenever his wife, Kate, is on, because she's brilliant and he can't stop showing just how obsessed he is with her, and I love it.
I've received both of my vaccines plus my booster, but it's in fact the Chris Hayes shot in the arm I receive each week that I am convinced keeps my mind and body running smoothly.
I like to use WithPod as a zero-commitment book club.
Why Is This Happening? The Chris Hayes Podcast. New episodes every Tuesday. Subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts.
One day after the FBI completed one of the quickest arrests in leak investigation modern history, the 21-year-old arrested in connection with the leak of that trove of classified documents appeared in court today. Jack Tejera was charged with possessing classified documents pertaining to national security and possessing national defense materials, which carry a maximum of 10 years behind bars. As we continue to learn more about just how and why he got a hold hold of those documents and disseminated them. It should come as no surprise to those of us who've been watching closely that on the fringes of the right in American politics, right after his arrest, the instinct was not to reflexively support law enforcement or U.S. national security or the Pentagon or intelligence, but to support the guy who endangered all those things. Hours after his arrest, Marjorie Taylor Greene tweeted her support for the suspected leaker, saying he was an enemy of the Biden regime, which nobody knows for sure. And she pushed the same anti-Ukraine line that the fringiest of the fringe has peddled since the war in Ukraine began. John Brennan and Michael McFaul are still with us. Director Brennan, I thought this represented a dangerous and important escalation of the right support for national security threats. It's one thing to be out there rah-rah cheering for the jailed January 6 defendants, many of whom have pleaded guilty to the charges they've been charged with, many of whom filmed their own criminal acts. But to take someone who has leaked national security, national defense information, and before a lot of the facts are even known, leap to his defense and platform a defense of him on the most watched program on Fox News represents a stunning and dangerous new development on the right.
Yes, these comments are absolutely contemptible. They are doing Putin's bidding for him. And by these comments, they are disrespecting and disparaging the selfless sacrifices that are made every day by women and men in the intelligence community, in the diplomatic service, in the U.S. military, those who really do all they can to keep their fellow citizens safe. And so people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who says these things, it really just shows not just their ignorance, but how much they are actually trying to undermine our national security and this country's freedom and democracy. And that's why I can't understand what is motivating them other than they're playing to this far right, this group of people who seem to have no sense of what this country's values, this country's democracy is all about. And that's why I don't have, words to express my anger and my disdain for what she and others are saying right now.
Well, I think what I always look to where the chips are falling on the right, and I didn't see, and if I missed it, I'll air it on Monday, but I didn't see Pompeo or Ratcliffe, two Trump appointees to head the nation's intelligence agencies, condemn the support for the leaker. But what seems to endanger the country and its institutions, regardless of who is running them and who's in control, is the illegality here is not in dispute, right? He's been charged with the crime. There's probable cause. The documents were disseminated. And the reflex and the permission structure to do it again has already been disseminated. It's done. The damage is done, Ambassador McFaul. And I wonder, John mentioned the Russians. Could the Russians have developed a play that efficient and that effective in all their wildest dreams?
Maybe. I doubt it. This is a self-inflicted wound. I just agree completely with what John said. I can't understand it. I can't understand how anybody who cares about the United States of America, who wants America to be great, can look at what this gentleman did and say, how does this advance any national security interests of the United States of America? That is just completely illogical to me. And people are making these claims on behalf of this gentleman, and he's not even making these claims. That's what's strange about it to me. This is different from other leakers who said they had some, thing that they were trying to do to advance democracy in America, et cetera. This is not that. And yet they do this. And I have to say, I'm just perplexed by it. I do not understand the strategy.
John, I don't pretend to understand the strategy, but I do know what happens on the right. Pompeo won't boycott Tucker Carlson's show because he endangered U.S. national security because he wants to be president. Neither will John Ratcliffe. What happens is the permission structure and the shrugging of the shoulders and the cowardice on the right is a feature of the Trumpian right. And the casualty over and over again isn't just the rule of law, but it is the very things that protect every one of us. How do we function as a democracy if one of the two parties shrugs its shoulder when it's threatened?
Well, I think we see continuously that one of those parties does do that all the time. And you're absolutely right. Silence is bad enough on the part of the Pompeos and Ratcliffes of the world. But those who actually are encouraging this type of behavior and this type of activity are actively abetting the undermining of our national security. And I'm still waiting for the Republican Party to come to its senses. And there are so few of the individuals in the Republican Party right now who I think really feel very strongly about U.S. national security needs to be protected. And so, the Kevin McCarthy's and others who need to come out very strongly and just denounce these comments made by Marjorie Taylor Greene and others, if they really truly believe that our national security is something important that needs to be protected and safeguarded in the future.
Liz Cheney, for one, came out swinging and said that Marjorie Taylor Greene should not have a security clearance. I'm going to ask both of you to weigh in on that on the other side of a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We're back with John Brennan and Michael McFaul. I'll read Liz Cheney's tweet in a second, but I want to start with what this is really about, it appears to be, with you, Ambassador McFaul. This has at its roots the disdain for American efforts to bolster Ukraine on the battlefield in its war against Russia. So this has, and I don't like to give the right too much credit for having a policy objective, but this is what Tucker Carlson said. I'm not going to play it. He praised Tahera as someone who told Americans what's actually happening in Ukraine and complained that the news media is treating him like bin Laden, maybe even worse, actually. Demonstrably false. But the idea that this is the enemy of my enemy becomes my friend because he too is against the war in Ukraine feels like a dangerous flashing red light.
Well, yes, it's a dangerous flashing red light. On the policy perspective, it's wrong. I categorically disagree with Tucker Carlson's view about American national interests with respect to European security and Ukraine. But it's bigger than that. They don't get to parse it that way. This leak also did real damage to our relationship with South Korea. Mm-hmm. And on the next breath, the Tucker Carlson others are always saying, we've got to be tougher on China. We've got to be tougher on China. Well, wait a minute. You cannot want to be tougher on China and have a sound policy towards China, as I do as well, and then say that this is okay to do this damage. In other words, we have national security interests here. We don't have Democrat and Republican security interests. And when they cherry pick things that just fit their narrative and not see the bigger damage that is done to, I think, our place in the world and our institutions, as John talked about, that I think is extremely dangerous.
Yeah, and I think in the spirit of damaging U.S. national security interests around the globe, Liz Cheney tweeted this, John. Marjorie Taylor Greene makes clear yet again that she cannot be trusted with America's national security information and should not have a security clearance of any kind. I wanted to know why she does. She apparently sits on the Homeland Security Committee of all things. Do you agree, though? And I guess if the speaker won't do it, he said there's nothing he wouldn't do for Marjorie Taylor Greene. This probably isn't a solvable national security problem.
Well, from my perspective, I think Marjorie Taylor Greene has demonstrated time and time again that she's not fit to hold public office with some of her commentary that she has made even previously. And so therefore, I believe that she should not be provided any type of sensitive classified information. And she does have some clearances because of her role within the Congress and position on certain committees. But in light of these comments that are made, and as you pointed out before, you could have this bizarre policy view that we shouldn't be helping Ukraine. And if you do have that, you can still decry and condemn the unauthorized disclosure of our classified information that has been having damage, I think, to our interests abroad. And so therefore, I totally agree with Liz Cheney. And more I find myself in league with Liz Cheney. And I'm glad to see that she, among the few Republicans out there, has a spine and is willing to speak up.
It is all too rare, though. John Brennan, Michael McFaul, thank you so much for ending our week with this conversation. It's great to see both of you. Another break for us. We'll be right back. President Joe Biden wrapped up his final full day overseas today. Since Wednesday, President Biden has been traveling around Ireland to honor the anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, a peace deal brokered by the U.S. 25 years ago. He also spoke to the Irish Parliament. Today, the president made an emotional return visit to a local hospice where a plaque honors his late son, Beau. And earlier, at a Catholic shrine, Biden encountered the priest who gave the last rites to Beau at Walter Reed Medical Center in 2015. A White House official tells NBC News President Biden was stunned to see him there. and the moment moved him to tears. Another break for us. We'll be right back. Thank you so much for letting us into your homes for another week of shows. We are so grateful.
Hey, everybody, it's Hoda Kotb
and Jenna Bush Hager.
And we got big news, y'all. Our show is now a podcast.
That's right. You can take us anywhere you go, in your car, to the gym, even just at home on your own couch with a glass of wine.
We like spending time with each other, and now we love that we can spend even more time with you. Are you sick of us yet?
Don't be, because you can never have to miss a moment of fun, laughs, or friendship.
Yeah, subscribe. Listen to Today with Hoda and Jenna wherever you get your podcasts.